John's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end of the line spoke quickly, delivering news that left him paralyzed in shock. His mind raced as he tried to process the gravity of what he had just heard. He stood frozen in his modest living room, the faint hum of the radio in the background, its cheerful music completely at odds with the turmoil inside him. How could this be happening? He thought, heart pounding. The voice on the other end continued, but John could barely listen anymore. His world, which had once felt predictable and steady, was now unraveling. Just a few days earlier, John had been living his quiet, unremarkable life. At 78 years old, John was a man who had seen it all. A life filled with joys and sorrows, though now most days seemed to blend into one another. He had outlived his wife, Margaret, by nearly a decade. His children were grown and scattered across the country, busy with their own families and careers. They called occasionally, usually on birthdays and holidays, but visits were rare. Despite the occasional bouts of loneliness, John had found comfort in routine. He lived in a small house on the edge of a quaint town, one of those places where everyone knew each other's names. Every morning, he'd take a walk down the main street, his cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. The local market was his main stop, a lively place where locals bought their groceries, shared news, and exchanged pleasantries. John had become a fixture there, always ready with a smile, and known for his small acts of kindness. He was the kind of man who'd hold the door for strangers, help someone with a heavy bag, or give a little extra change to someone who was short on cash. Though he lived on a modest pension and had to budget carefully, John had always believed that no one was too poor to be kind. It was this belief that would set in motion a series of events far beyond anything he could have imagined. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, and John made his way to the market as usual. The autumn sun was bright, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and ripe apples from the local stands. Children laughed as they played by the fountain, and the familiar faces of neighbors passed him by with cheerful waves and greetings. The market was bustling. Vendors were calling out their wares, trying to attract customers. John enjoyed the atmosphere. It was a comfort to him, a reminder that even though he lived alone, he was never truly by himself in this close-knit community. He shuffled through the aisles, grabbing the few essentials he needed for the week. Milk, bread, some fruit. Nothing fancy. As he moved toward the checkout line, something caught his attention. Just ahead of him was a young woman, Sarah, with two small children. One of the children, a boy of about 6, was tugging on her jacket, asking for candy, while the younger girl, barely 3, clung to her leg, looking tired and hungry. Sarah's face was flushed, not just from the exertion of managing 2 young kids, but from the embarrassment of what was unfolding at the checkout counter. "I'm sorry, Mom, but your card's been declined," the cashier said, her voice soft but firm. Sarah's face reddened further as she fumbled through her wallet, pulling out another card. She swiped it, but again, the dreaded beep echoed through the store. Declined. John watched from behind, his heart going out to the young mother. He could see the frustration and panic in her eyes as she struggled to figure out what to do next. She began to pull items from her cart, setting aside the essentials: milk, diapers, and bread, leaving behind the small luxuries: a box of cereal her son had picked out, a pack of juice boxes, a small chocolate treat for the kids. The little boy's face crumpled in disappointment as he watched his mother take the cereal box away. But he didn't say anything. Sarah was trying her best to stay calm, but John could see the weariness in her eyes. He had no idea what her story was, but he knew struggle when he saw it. John's heart ached for Sarah. He knew how tough times could be, and he also knew what it was like to feel like you were just barely holding it all together. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was his place to step in. But then, as he looked at the young mother's defeated posture and the hopeful eyes of her children, he made a decision. "I've got it," John said, stepping forward with a warm smile. Sarah looked up, startled. No, no, I can't let you. It's nothing, John insisted. Just let me help. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It wasn't thick with bills, but there was enough. He handed his card to the cashier, who gave him a questioning look but quickly processed the payment when John nodded. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you, she stammered, looking at the groceries now safely packed into bags. No thanks necessary, John said, waving it off. I've had my share of help in life. Just pay it forward when you can. Sarah smiled, the weight of her struggle momentarily lifted, and her son, oblivious to the complexities of adult life, beamed up at John. Thank you, mister, the boy said, holding tightly to the box of cereal that had almost been left behind. John felt a warmth in his chest. It was a small thing, really, to help someone in need. But sometimes the smallest things could make the biggest difference. After Sarah and her children left, John lingered in the market for a moment, feeling content. He hadn't thought much of the gesture. It was just the right thing to do. His groceries were bagged and paid for, and he headed home, feeling like it had been an ordinary day. But little did he know, that single moment of kindness would set off a ripple effect that would soon come crashing back into his life in ways he never expected. That night, as John sat in his favorite armchair, reading the evening paper, he thought about Sarah and her kids. He hoped things would get better for them. It was a fleeting thought, just another moment of reflection in his otherwise quiet life. But what John didn't know was that this act of kindness wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. John didn't expect anything in return for helping Sarah that day at the market. It was just a moment of kindness, a small gesture he would have done for anyone. But Sarah saw it differently. To her, it was more than just a man paying for a few groceries. It was a lifeline during a moment of desperation. A few days after the incident at the market, John was walking his usual path through town when he heard someone call out to him. It was Sarah, rushing to catch up with him, her children in tow. She had that same harried look on her face, but there was also a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. Mr. John, wait, she called, slightly out of breath. I've been trying to find you. John smiled warmly. No need to thank me again, dear. It was nothing. But Sarah shook her head. It wasn't nothing to me, she said, her voice soft but earnest. I don't know what I would have done without your help that day. You didn't just pay for groceries. You gave me a chance to breathe. John shifted awkwardly, not used to receiving such praise. He wasn't one for grand gestures or making a fuss. I'm just glad I could help, he said humbly. You seemed like you had your hands full. Sarah laughed lightly, though it didn't hide the tiredness behind her eyes. That's one way to put it. Things have been tough lately. She paused for a moment, seemingly unsure whether to continue. But something about John, perhaps his quiet demeanor or the kindness he had already shown, made her feel safe enough to open up. I'm a single mom now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as her children played nearby. It's been a few months since my husband left. He just walked out one day, said he couldn't handle it anymore. Now it's just me and the kids. John's heart ached as he listened. He had heard similar stories from neighbors, families falling apart under the pressures of life. It made him think of his own life, of Margaret, his late wife, and how they had weathered every storm together, right up until the day she was taken by illness. Now the house that had once been filled with her laughter and the scent of her cooking was silent and still. I'm sorry to hear that, John said, his voice gentle. It must be hard, raising two little ones all by yourself. It is, Sarah admitted. I'm working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. Some days I don't know how I'll make it through, but I have to. For them. She glanced at her children with a weary but loving smile. John nodded, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had never realized just how much people around him were struggling. His own hardships had made him retreat into his quiet routine, but here was someone in the middle of their fight, pushing forward for the sake of her children. and all he had done was pay for some groceries. It felt so small in comparison to the battles Sarah faced every day. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," John said, surprising even himself with the weight of his words. He wasn't used to giving out advice, but in that moment, he felt like Sarah needed to hear it. "And you're not alone. People around here look out for each other." Sarah smiled gratefully. "Thank you, John. I don't know how to repay you, but if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." John brushed off her gratitude once again, saying it was nothing, but inside, something had shifted. The connection he felt with Sarah, and even her children, stirred something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose. As John walked home that day, he couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He lived alone in the house he had shared with Margaret for decades. After she passed, the house had started to feel more like a museum, a collection of memories that he wandered through each day. The rooms were quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. His children were grown, each living their own lives far from this small town. They'd visited when they could, but those visits had become fewer and farther between. Phone calls came on holidays, short and filled with polite updates, but never the deep conversations they used to share. It wasn't their fault. They were busy, and John didn't want to be a burden. Still, the loneliness gnawed at him, especially at night. He filled his days with routine, walking to the market, chatting with neighbors, and tending to his small garden. But it never filled the void that Margaret's absence had left, until now. That brief encounter with Sarah and her children sparked something in John. Helping them, even in such a small way, made him feel connected to something larger than himself again. It was as if his life, which had become a series of predictable, quiet days, was suddenly infused with meaning. He didn't know what it was about Sarah's situation that struck him so deeply. Perhaps it was the reminder of the struggles he and Margaret had faced when they were young parents, or perhaps it was just the kindness that Sarah had unknowingly given back to him. Either way, John felt lighter, as if some of his own burdens had been lifted by helping lift hers. Days turned into weeks, and John continued his usual routine. He saw Sarah from time to time, always with her children, and each time, she greeted him with warmth and gratitude. Her children, too, had grown fond of him, waving excitedly whenever they saw him in the street. But it wasn't just Sarah and her children. John began to notice that other people in the town seemed to be treating him differently. The cashier at the market smiled a little wider when he came through the line, and the neighbors he passed on his walks offered more than just a quick nod. They stopped to chat, asking how he was doing, inviting him to join them for coffee. At first, John thought it was just his imagination, but the change was undeniable. His one act of kindness seemed to have rippled out beyond Sarah and her children. People in the town were noticing him more, and in a way, it felt like they were recognizing him not just as a kindly old man, but as someone who had made a difference. John wasn't used to being the center of attention, and while it was heartwarming, it also made him uneasy. He hadn't done anything special, not really. He had just paid for groceries. But as the days passed, the warmth of the town's response made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, like he belonged. One crisp autumn morning, John went out to check his mailbox. It was mostly filled with the usual bills, advertisements, and a letter from his son. But nestled among the stack was a small plain envelope with no return address. Curious, John brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table as he finished his morning routine. When he finally sat down to open the envelope, he found a simple, handwritten note inside. The message was brief, but it sent a chill down his spine. To the man who gave more than he knows, your kindness has not gone unnoticed. Something big is coming your way. Be ready. John stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. His mind raced. Who could have sent this? Why was it so cryptic? He wasn't the type to get involved in anything dramatic or out of the ordinary. His life was simple and quiet, but the note made him uneasy. What could it mean? For the rest of the day, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. The warmth of the town, the gratitude of Sarah, the smiles of her children. All of it seemed to be leading to something bigger than he could have anticipated. And while part of him was intrigued, another part of him was filled with dread. It had been a few quiet days since John found the cryptic letter in his mailbox, and while it lingered in the back of his mind, life had returned to its usual rhythm. The letter's message, "Something big is coming your way. Be ready," felt distant now, almost like a strange dream. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It didn't seem like the sort of thing you brought up casually. And so he carried on, as he always did, with his morning walks, visits to the market, and tending to the house. But then, on a gray and drizzly afternoon, the phone rang. John was in the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch of soup and crackers when the shrill sound of the telephone cut through the air. He frowned, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he made his way to the phone. It wasn't often that anyone called during the day. Perhaps it was his son, finally finding time to catch up, or maybe a neighbor checking in. "Hello," John answered, his voice steady but curious. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the sound of paper shuffling. Then, a voice, firm, professional, and unfamiliar. "Good afternoon. Is this John Matthews?" the caller asked. "Yes, this is he. Who's calling?" "My name is Robert Hale. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Sarah Whitman. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share." John's heart seemed to stop for a moment. The name Sarah Whitman echoed in his mind. Sarah, the young mother from the market. His mind raced, trying to piece together why a lawyer would be calling him about her. I'm sorry. What is this about?" John asked, his voice suddenly shaky. "I'm afraid I have to inform you that Ms. Whitman passed away 3 days ago in a car accident," the lawyer said, his voice calm but somber. "She was struck by a driver while crossing an intersection near her home." John's knees buckled, and he had to steady himself against the kitchen counter. The room seemed to tilt around him. Sarah, gone. He had just seen her a few days ago, bustling around town with her children, smiling, full of life. It didn't seem possible. How did this happen?" John stammered. The lawyer explained briefly, but John could hardly absorb the details. All he could think about was Sarah's 2 young children. What would happen to them? Who would take care of them? "I know this must come as a shock," the lawyer continued, "but I'm calling because Ms. Whitman named you in her will." John blinked, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Me? Why would she? In the weeks following John's kind gesture at the market, Sarah had tried to repay him in small ways. She had knocked on his door several times, offering homemade meals, thanking him with words that felt far too grand for what John thought was such a small favor. Each time, John would politely decline the food, insisting that he didn't need anything in return. "Really, Sarah," he would say. It was no trouble at all. But Sarah didn't see it that way. To her, John had done more than just buy her groceries. He had shown her kindness when she felt at her lowest. She had shared her story with a community group she attended, a small circle of single mothers who supported one another. When she spoke of John's act of generosity, her words sparked something among the group. They began paying it forward in their own small ways, helping neighbors, supporting struggling families. What John had done rippled outward, affecting far more lives than he would ever know. Still, Sarah had wanted to do more than just express her gratitude with words. She felt a deep sense of responsibility to honor the kindness John had shown her, and it was this sense that had led her to make the decision that would soon turn John's life upside down. Back in the present, John was still trying to process the lawyer's words when Mr. Hale continued speaking. "Ms. Whitman was deeply moved by the kindness you showed her and her children," he explained. "In her will, she expressed that if anything were to happen to her, she wanted you to be the legal guardian of her 2 children, Daniel and Lily." The words hung in the air like a weight that John could barely comprehend. For a long moment, there was only silence as John struggled to breathe. "Me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm an old man. I'm not." How could she think? She had no family to rely on, the lawyer said gently. Her parents passed away years ago, and the children's father is not in the picture. She believed that you would provide a stable and caring home for them, and that you would honor her wishes. John's mind reeled. Guardian of 2 small children. He was 78 years old, barely able to manage his own life. How could he take on the responsibility of raising 2 young children, especially when he had no experience with parenting, since his own children were now grown and far away? I can't do this," John finally said, his voice trembling. "I'm too old. I don't have the means." "I understand this is overwhelming," Mr. Hale replied. "But Ms. Whitman's will was very clear. She trusted you, Mr. Matthews. She believed in your kindness and in your ability to care for her children. I'm here to help guide you through the process, but ultimately, the decision is yours. If you feel you cannot take on this responsibility, the court will find another guardian." John's heart felt like it was being pulled in 2 directions. How could Sarah have asked this of him? He had only known her for a brief time. He had no idea she had placed such trust in him. No idea that his small act of kindness had meant so much. But as he thought about Daniel and Lily, those bright-eyed, innocent children, his heart ached. He could still picture their faces. Daniel's big, hopeful eyes, full of curiosity, and Lily's quiet smile, so much like her mother's. What would happen to them if he said no? Would they end up in the foster system, separated, moved from home to home? The weight of Sarah's request felt unbearable. John hung up the phone in a daze and collapsed into his armchair, staring out the window. The rain had picked up, blurring the view outside. His thoughts spiraled, filled with questions and doubts. Could he really do this? At his age, he wasn't in the best health, and his finances were modest at best. The house wasn't equipped for children. It was small, with stairs that creaked and corners that collected dust. How could he suddenly become a father again? And yet, the thought of saying no felt wrong, even selfish. Sarah had trusted him. She had seen something in him that made her believe he could give her children the love and stability they needed. Could he really turn his back on that? John sat in silence for hours, the house eerily quiet around him. His mind wandered back to Margaret, to the life they had shared, and to the dreams they had once had of growing old together with their children and grandchildren nearby. Life hadn't turned out the way they had planned. And now, here he was, facing a decision that could change everything. As the rain continued to fall outside, John closed his eyes and whispered to himself, what would Margaret have done? He knew the answer before he even finished the thought. Margaret had always been the generous one, the one who opened their home to neighbors in need, the one who believed that love and kindness could solve anything. She would have said yes, without hesitation. And in that moment, John knew that he couldn't let Sarah's children go. He didn't know how he would manage, or what the future would hold, but he couldn't turn his back on them. He wouldn't let them become another sad story in a broken system. With a deep breath, John picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Hale's number. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'll take the children." Word spread quickly throughout the small town that John Matthews, a man in his late 70s, had taken in 2 young children after the sudden death of their mother. It didn't take long for the community to form opinions. What had once been a quiet and uneventful place was now buzzing with whispers and gossip about John's decision. At the market, at church, and on the streets, people were talking. Some viewed John as a hero, an embodiment of kindness and selflessness. They saw his actions as a continuation of the quiet compassion he'd always shown, stepping in to care for Sarah's children when no one else could. "You hear about old John. Bless him, he's doing what none of us could," a shopkeeper said one morning, shaking his head in admiration. "Taken on 2 little ones at his age. The man's got a heart of gold." But others weren't so sure. There were murmurs of doubt, questions about whether John, who was clearly in the twilight of his life, was really capable of raising two energetic young children. "He's too old to be chasing after kids," a neighbor whispered to another in the town square. "What if he falls ill? Who's going to take care of them then? They need stability, not some half-broken old man." As the town divided into two camps, John became the subject of both admiration and criticism. On one hand, people dropped off casseroles and groceries, offering support, while others, less charitable, gossiped in hushed tones, hinting that it was only a matter of time before John failed, and the children would need to be placed elsewhere. John could feel the weight of their judgment every time he stepped outside. He could see it in the way people looked at him, a mixture of pity and doubt. And while he tried to stay focused on the children, the whispers got louder and harder to ignore. Taking care of Daniel and Lily had proven to be even harder than John had anticipated. His small house, with its creaky floors and narrow hallways, was far from child-friendly. The kids needed space to run, but all he could offer them was a tiny backyard and a house cluttered with old furniture and memories. The mornings were the hardest. John had gotten used to waking up slowly, easing into the day with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. But now, every morning was a whirlwind of chaos. Daniel, the older of the two, was constantly asking questions, endless streams of why this, and how does that work? While Lily, still too young to understand what was happening, clung to John's leg, often crying out of confusion and fear. John felt the sting of truth in Mark's words, but there was something about his tone, the way he seemed more concerned with taking control than with what was best for the children. Still, the man was their uncle. He was family. Didn't that count for something? Mark continued, his voice softer now, almost persuasive. "Look, I got a house, a job. I can give them the life Sarah wanted for them. They'll be safe with me." John looked at Daniel and Lily, playing quietly in the corner of the living room. He could see their uncertainty, their confusion about everything that had happened. They had already lost their mother. Was it right to uproot them again? And yet, wasn't it selfish to hold on to them if he couldn't give them the life they deserved? That night, after Mark left, John sat alone in the living room, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had promised Sarah that he would take care of her children, that he would be there for them. But now, with Mark's arrival, the path forward wasn't so clear. Was he holding on to them because he truly believed he was the best choice, or was it because he couldn't bear the thought of being alone again? He had grown attached to Daniel and Lily in ways he hadn't expected. They had brought light back into his life, filled the empty spaces with laughter and chaos. But love wasn't enough, was it? They needed more than just affection. They needed stability, a future that John wasn't sure he could provide. As the town remained divided, John found himself torn between the promise he had made to Sarah and the harsh reality of his limitations. Could he really do this, or was it time to let them go? John sat in his worn armchair, staring out the window as dusk settled over the town. The children were asleep upstairs, their innocent breathing the only sound that filled the house. It had been days since Sarah's estranged brother, Mark, had shown up on John's doorstep, demanding to take custody of Daniel and Lily. But the weight of the decision that loomed over John now felt like a mountain pressing down on his chest. What was he supposed to do? The question gnawed at him every waking moment, and even invaded his dreams at night. John had made a promise to Sarah, a promise to care for her children. She had trusted him, believed in his kindness, and had seen something in him that made her confident he could provide the love and stability her children needed. But the reality was far more complicated. John knew his limits. His health was deteriorating. The constant strain of taking care of two young children was taking a toll on his body, and he could feel it in the stiffness of his joints and the shortness of his breath. He hadn't told anyone, but he'd started feeling dizzy from time to time, his heart fluttering in ways that made him pause. He didn't want to admit it, but the idea of growing weaker terrified him. And what if something happened to him while the children were still in his care? But the thought of handing Daniel and Lily over to Mark filled him with a different kind of dread. Mark wasn't just some stranger. He was Sarah's brother. He was their uncle, and by rights, family should come first. But something about Mark made John uneasy. There was a hardness to him, a gruffness that hinted at a troubled past. And while Mark had spoken about giving the children a stable home, John couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't seeing the full picture. Could Mark really be trusted? The question swirled in John's mind as he struggled with the decision before him. He knew he had to do what was best for the children, but what if his judgment was clouded by his own fears of being alone again? As the days passed, John's health began to decline further. The stress of the situation weighed heavily on him, and there were moments when he felt like his body was betraying him. Simple tasks that had once been easy now seemed insurmountable. He tried to hide it from the children, putting on a brave face, but there were times when Daniel would look at him with concern in his young eyes, as if sensing that something was wrong. John knew he couldn't keep going like this. One afternoon, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down harder than ever, he decided to visit Sarah's grave. It was a cool, gray day with the sky heavy with the promise of rain. John made the slow walk to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, his cane tapping softly against the gravel path. When he reached Sarah's grave, he stood there in silence for a long time, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees above him. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet. "You trusted me to take care of them, but I'm not sure I can. And now your brother's come. I don't know if he's the right choice, either." John stared at the simple headstone, his heart aching with the weight of responsibility. "I just wish you were here to tell me what to do," he murmured, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't want to let you down, but I'm scared I already have." The wind picked up, swirling around him, as if offering no answer but reminding him of the fleeting nature of time. He stayed for a while longer, but even after pouring his heart out at Sarah's grave, he was no closer to an answer. As he made his way home, his thoughts were still a tangled mess of doubt and uncertainty. That night, after tucking the children into bed, John sat with Daniel and Lily, wanting to talk to them about the situation, though he struggled to find the right words. Daniel, always perceptive, had been sensing that something was wrong for days now, and Lily, though younger, had clung to John even more tightly than usual. "Daniel," John said softly, sitting on the edge of the boy's bed, "there's something we need to talk about." Daniel sat up, his small face serious as he looked at John. "Is it about Uncle Mark?" he asked, his voice tentative. John nodded, surprised by the boy's intuition. "Yes, it is. He wants you and Lily to go live with him." At this, Lily, who had been sitting quietly beside John, immediately shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Grandpa John," she cried, using the name she had started calling him, though he wasn't technically their grandfather. "We want to stay with you." Daniel was quieter, but his face was troubled. "Why can't we stay here?" he asked, his voice small. "Do you want us to go?" The question pierced John's heart. "Of course I don't want you to go," he said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to make sure you're taken care of, no matter what. I'm not as young as I used to be, and I worry that I might not be able to give you everything you need." Lily hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "We don't care," she whispered. "We just want you." Daniel, always the more thoughtful of the two, looked down at his hands. "Uncle Mark doesn't like us," he said quietly. "He didn't even come see us before. Why does he want us now?" John had no answer for that. It was the same question he had been asking himself. He pulled both children close to him, feeling the warmth of their trust and love. And in that moment, he knew that whatever decision he made, it had to be for them. It had to be for their future, not for his own fear of loneliness. As John wrestled with his decision, the town itself became more divided. Some of his neighbors had rallied around him, offering to help with the children however they could. Mrs. Lawson and Mr. Perez continued to stop by with meals, toys, and offers to babysit. They believed in John's ability to care for Daniel and Lily, and they admired his dedication to fulfilling Sarah's wishes. Others, however, were not so supportive. A few vocal members of the community had begun to campaign for John to give up the children, arguing that he was too old and frail to raise them properly. They spoke of how children needed stability and energy, things that a man of John's age couldn't provide. There were heated conversations at the local diner and in the market, with some siding with John and others siding with Mark. Even the local authorities were keeping a close eye on the situation, unsure of which way it would turn. The confrontation came a few days later. Mark arrived at John's house unannounced, his expression tense and impatient. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to settle things once and for all. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Mark said bluntly as soon as he stepped inside. "I'm filing for custody of the kids." John's heart sank, but he stood his ground. "Sarah wanted them with me, Mark. She made that clear in her will." Sarah didn't know what she was doing. Mark snapped, his frustration boiling over. "She was too proud to ask for help, even from her own family. But I'm their uncle, and they belong with me." John took a deep breath, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "If you care so much, why weren't you there for them before? Why didn't Sarah feel like she could turn to you?" Mark's face darkened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. Then, in a voice that was almost too low to hear, he said, "Because of our father." John frowned, confused. "Your father?" Mark's shoulders sagged, and he sat down heavily on the nearest chair. "Our father. He wasn't a good man," Mark admitted. "He was hard on us, on Sarah, especially. I didn't protect her like I should have. I left when I was old enough, and I didn't look back. But Sarah stayed behind, and I think she never forgave me for abandoning her." John sat down opposite Mark, his anger melting into understanding. This wasn't just about the children. It was about guilt, about family wounds that had never healed. "I didn't know," John said quietly. Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking weary. "I'm not perfect, John, but I'm still their family. I know I made mistakes, but I want to make things right." In that moment, John realized that this decision wasn't just about him and his fears. It wasn't even just about Sarah's wishes. It was about the children and what was truly best for them. Could he give them the future they deserved? Or was it time to let them go, to give them the chance to be with family? Even if that family came with the decision weighed heavily on John's heart. But after his confrontation with Mark, he realized that the children's best interest had to come first. Despite Mark's sincere apology and the burden of his past, John couldn't ignore the bond that had already formed between him and the children. They needed stability, love, and someone who understood their emotional needs. And though John had doubts about his age and health, he knew that with the right support, he could offer them the care and nurturing they deserved. So, one evening, after putting the children to bed, John called Mark. The conversation was difficult, but John explained that while he appreciated Mark's offer, he believed the children were better off staying with him. "They've been through enough," John said softly, his voice steady. "They need to be somewhere familiar, somewhere they feel safe. If you're serious about being part of their lives, we can make that happen. But for now, they need to stay here, with me." To John's surprise, Mark didn't argue. He simply sighed, resigned, and agreed to let the children stay with John, but with the understanding that he would be involved in their lives moving forward. It wasn't the complete severing of ties John had feared. Instead, it was a compromise, a way to keep the children in the place where they had begun to heal, while allowing them the chance to get to know their uncle in time. With Mark's departure, the decision was finally made. John would keep Daniel and Lily, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. As word spread through the town that John had officially taken the children in, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once doubted him now stepped forward to help. Mrs. Lawson and Mr. Perez were the first, offering their regular support with meals and repairs, but others soon followed. The local pastor organized a weekly schedule of volunteers to help with childcare, meals, and even transportation to school. The community, once divided over John's ability to care for the children, began to rally behind him. Some neighbors donated clothes, books, and toys, while others offered financial assistance to help with the extra costs of raising two young children. People who had barely spoken to John before now stopped by regularly to check on him and the kids, bringing with them warmth and a sense of collective care that John had never experienced so deeply. The transformation was not just in John's household, but in the entire town. What had once been a quiet place filled with small talk and routine now buzzed with a renewed sense of togetherness. The market, where John had once quietly passed through on his own, became a place where neighbors gathered not just for groceries, but to ask about the children, to offer help, and to share in each other's lives. For John, the shift was profound. His life, once marked by loneliness and repetition, had now taken on a new meaning. The house, which had once felt empty and cold after Margaret's passing, was now alive with the sounds of laughter, footsteps running through the halls, and the occasional playful argument between Daniel and Lily. It was chaotic, yes, and there were days when John's body ached more than usual, but the warmth and joy that the children brought into his life far outweighed any discomfort. Daniel, with his curious mind and endless questions, had given John a new reason to engage with the world. Together, they worked on small projects around the house, John teaching him how to use tools, fix broken furniture, and tend to the garden. Lily, with her quiet sweetness, often climbed onto John's lap in the evenings, content to sit in silence while he read her stories or watched the sunset from the porch. John's heart, once heavy with grief and loneliness, was now filled with love and purpose. The children had given him a second chance at family, a chance he never expected to have again. And in return, John had become a father figure to them, someone they trusted and relied on. He could see it in the way they ran to him when they were scared, in the way they looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. It wasn't just John who had changed. The children, too, had transformed. Where once they had been filled with fear and uncertainty, they now seemed more settled, more secure. The weight of their loss still hung over them, but with John's steady presence, they were beginning to heal. As John's life filled with new meaning, the town itself began to change in subtle but powerful ways. The people who had once gossiped about John's decision now saw the power of kindness in action. The market, which had once been just a place to shop, became a hub of connection. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to reach out to one another, inspired by the way the community had come together to support John and the children. Small acts of kindness spread throughout the town, people helping each other with groceries, organizing playdates for their children, and offering rides to those who didn't have transportation. It was as if the town had realized that in supporting one person, they could create a ripple effect that touched everyone's lives. The market became more than just a place to buy food. It became a symbol of the community's bond, a place where stories were shared, support was offered, and friendships were forged. The town's heart had been renewed, and John's story became a reminder that one small act of kindness could change the course of many lives. Just when it seemed like things had finally settled into a new rhythm, John received a phone call that would add one last twist to the story. It was a quiet afternoon, and John was sitting in the living room, watching Daniel and Lily build a tower out of blocks. The phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the peaceful silence. John picked up the receiver. "Hello," he answered, expecting a neighbor or a volunteer checking in. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but polite. "Mr. Matthews, my name is Catherine McBride." I knew Sarah. John's heart skipped a beat. "Yes," he said cautiously. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been trying to find a way to contact you for some time. I knew Sarah from when we were younger. I just wanted you to know that the reason Sarah chose you to take care of her children wasn't just because of what you did at the market." John frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "She told me once that she had met you many years ago, back when you and your wife used to volunteer at the community center. You probably don't remember, but Sarah was part of the youth program you helped with. You and Margaret, You made a big impact on her. She said you were the first people who made her feel like she mattered, like she had someone who believed in her. That's why she chose you, John. Not just because of the groceries, but because you were already a part of her life, even if you didn't know it. John sat back in his chair, the weight of Catherine's words sinking in. He had no memory of Sarah from those years, but it made sense now. He and Margaret had spent years volunteering at the community center, working with troubled youth, offering support and guidance. Could it be that Sarah had been one of those kids, quietly taking in the kindness they had offered? Suddenly, everything made sense. Sarah hadn't just chosen him because of the small act of kindness at the market. She had chosen him because, in a way, he had already been her guardian long before she ever needed one for her children. John hung up the phone, his heart full of a quiet peace. He looked over at Daniel and Lily, who were now laughing as they knocked over their block tower, and he smiled. One small act of kindness, he thought. It had seemed so insignificant at the time, but that simple gesture had set off a chain of events that had transformed not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The children, the town, even Sarah's estranged brother had been touched by the ripple effect of that one moment. He couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he hadn't stepped in that day. And then he thought of Margaret, of the life they had shared, and he knew that she would have been proud of him for keeping his heart open, for choosing love even when it wasn't easy. As the sun set over the town, John felt a sense of closure. His life had changed in ways he never could have anticipated, but for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Looking at the children, he couldn't help but ask himself, would I have made the same choice if I knew how much it would change me? But deep down, he already knew the answer.